The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, a moral budget to end poverty in America, the massive failure of the GOP tax plan, and a conversation with Wendy Sherman, lead negotiator on the Iran nuclear deal. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you could join us. In June, the Poor People's Campaign, along with the Institute for Policy Studies, released a moral budget to end poverty in America. Shali Gupta Barnes is one of its authors, and she says it's a necessary response to the needs of all Americans. And we say hello to Joseph Ciricione, president of Plowshares Fund, a global security foundation. He is also the author of the books Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It Is Too Late, Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons, and Deadly Arsenals, Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Threats. Joe Ciricione, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And those are all my romance novels.
Yeah.
Cheery little titles, don't you think?
Yes, they are. Boy, they'd brighten anybody's day. And pardon the pun on that with the mushroom cloud and all that.
Yeah,
anyway.
That's right.
Yeah, so welcome back, I should start off by saying, Joe.
Sure.
And the title of your latest op-ed is Trump is Misleading America into a New War. And in it, you say, a new Middle East war is coming, perhaps soon. Now, anytime Trump speaks nowadays, a lot of times people will just take it as bluster. But what makes you, right now, feel so strongly about this?
I don't think the president himself wants to go to war. I think he understands this would be a huge impact on the global economy. The oil supplies through the Straits of Hormuz, about a third of the world's oil supplies would stop dead in their tracks, probably triggering a U.S. recession, probably costing him the election. So I think he's got some very real political calculations for not wanting to go to war. But his strategy is so inept. It is all pressure and no plan, that I'm afraid we're bumbling our way into a war. Here's what I mean. Since John Bolton became National Security Advisor last spring, he first got Trump out of the nuclear deal, the deal that we had with Iran that was stopping them from getting a bomb, that had already done everything Trump says he wants to do, rolled back the program, froze it, put it under the strictest inspection regime on the planet. You know, we really dismantled major pieces, most of the Iran, what they call civilian nuclear program. We had stopped their path to a bomb. We pulled out of it. The Iranians stayed in it. The Europeans stayed in it. The plan is still working. But nonetheless, even though we violated the deal and Iran is still complying, he began this maximum pressure campaign, hammering them with sanctions, trying to isolate them, believing that the sanctions alone might do something, might accomplish his goals, might cause Iran to collapse or capitulate. Well, Iran is not collapsing or capitulating. So what's the point? Where's the end game? And that's why you've seen Bolton and Pompeo and now Trump sort of ratcheting up the rhetoric, threatening total obliteration, et cetera, setting down red lines. And the fear is that all this pressure is going to trigger some sort of military confrontation. I think there are people like Bolton and Pompeo who want that military confrontation. Some of our allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, want a military confrontation. And I think at some point Trump may be man-shamed into going ahead. He's going to be told, you can't back down now, Mr. President. You know, your credibility is at stake. Something just happened, and you have to respond, and it'll be off to the races. And it won't be a one-shot strike like he did with Syria. Maybe he thinks that's the case. It'll be, if we attack Iran, Iran's going to attack back, and this could quickly escalate into the biggest war we've had since Vietnam.
What's your understanding, Joe, of why this is happening? Obviously, you can't downplay the president's ego, of course, but there is a larger vision at play once you bring John Bolton into the discussion.
Well, this is something that people may not understand. The Bolton worldview, embraced by neoconservatives and some hardline, or some people call paleo-conservatives, like Mike Pompeo, is that the point of U.S. power in the world, the point of the U.S. sort of hegemony in the world, is to transform other people's governments, transform other countries. That's what motivated the war in Iraq. We believe that by we could bring democracy to the Middle East on the points of our bayonets. We thought it'd be quick and easy. It's been a disaster. Cost $6 trillion, tens of thousands of U.S. lives, 600,000 soldiers injured that were now going to be on disability for the rest of their lives. So this is hundreds of thousands of civilians killed. It didn't work. There's no democracy now in the Middle East, but they still believe this. That, and I think for Bolton, there's a bigger sort of geopolitical view. The view is that we can, through military force, overthrow the government of Iran, establish a pro-Western regime there, do the same with other governments in the region, and in so doing, secure America's interests in the region, including access to oil and gas in the region for generations to come. And that puts us in a very strong position to then confront and cause China to back down. As China rises, the U.S. will meet that challenge. This may sound like an apocalyptic vision of what the world is like, but for Bolton and others, in sort of this Hobbesian view, it's a zero-sum game. It's a dog-eat-dog world. It's rough out there. We got to be the biggest, toughest dog on the block, and that means we're going to use our military force to force other governments to do what we want. That's the view that motivates all this.
Several years ago, Russia tried this in Afghanistan. That didn't work. We learned nothing. It's just,
and we tried it in Vietnam, and we've tried it throughout Central America. I mean, it's not just other countries that have tried to do this, but you're absolutely right. Other countries have believed that through military force, you can, extend and enforce the rule of empire, and it works for a while. America had a different course after World War II. This system of alliances and economic integration and political integration and that we built up. And what's happening now is you're seeing Bolton and Pompeo and Trump systematically dismantle this 70-year-old international order with nothing to replace it. They're great at tearing things down. They prove terrible at erecting new sound structures to replace them.
Do you have any hope Congress can intervene, perhaps by regaining control over the power to authorize war, or maybe in some other way?
Yes, I do. Ever since the Democrats took control over Congress, you've seen them be more assertive, and you can sort of see them sort of gaining their footing. So, particularly on Iran, Democrats have introduced legislation in both the Senate and the House to curtail Trump's ability to wage war. So there's Tim Kaine and Senator from Virginia and Senator Mark Udall in the Senate have introduced legislation that will declare that any use of Defense Department funds for a war with Iran that is not expressly authorized by Congress is prohibited. In the House side, you have Congressman Ro Khanna and Anthony Brown and Seth Moulton, now joined by House Armed Services Committee Chairman Adam Smith, by the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative Engel, and others joining this. And these two will be bills that they will try to attach to the Defense Authorization Act. There's a good chance it'll succeed, actually, in both houses. This will set up a confrontation with the president. But this is just the beginning of their efforts. You see them talking about it. You see them writing about it. You see the presidential candidates talking more about this. So, yes, the opposition to this war is building.
We're speaking with Joe Ciricione, president of Plowshares Fund, which is a global security foundation. And Joe, the concern of your organization is nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. How much does the situation now with Iran add to the threat of both those things happening?
Right. So we got involved in the Iran issue not because we're anti-war. We're not a pacifist organization, but we're against the spread of nuclear weapons. And the accord that was struck with Iran, the accord that was struck with Iran is the strongest non-proliferation agreement in decades. This is not a flawed deal. This was not a compromise arrangement. This was the kind of bargain you always get in arms control, where both sides give and both sides win. This deal rolled back Iran's nuclear program. They had to dismantled 13,000 centrifuges. They took the core of their reactor that could be used to produce plutonium and filled it with concrete. They exported the uranium gas that could be used to build the core of a bomb. 98% of it was gone. We put an inspection regime in place that is unmatched on the planet. Toughest inspection regime. We know exactly what the Iranians are doing, and Trump walked away from all this. So this is an agreement that our allies support, that the United Nations Security Council endorsed, that is, this, as I say, the strongest nuclear security agreement reached, well, probably since the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. This is something to be proud of. That's why we got involved. We want to see these kinds of effective agreements reached. In fact, it serves as a model for the kind of agreement we could reach with North Korea. North Korea is never going to give up its nuclear weapons in one fell swoop. But if you approach it with this kind of agreement, roll back your program, freeze it, put it under inspections, then you can build on that in future agreements, future accords. That's the way you convince countries to take a different path. No country has ever been compelled to give up a nuclear program, but a lot of people have been convinced to.
And there's give and take here in a deal like this, where and it just allows you more control, and it's it seems to me anyway, a much smoother process towards the final goal.
Right. Whenever you're dealing with two countries that fundamentally do not trust each other, and boy, the Iran and U.S. do not trust each other on both sides. You know, we have 40 years of conflict since the Iranian Revolution. You have to reach an agreement that is sustainable, that is verifiable, that is very precise in what each side is going to do, and then that can be implemented over the course of many years. And in the process of doing that, you start to build up maybe trust, but more importantly, you build up mechanisms for resolving your conflicts. You're not going to, Iran's never going to love us. We're never going to be an ally of this government, but you don't have to be in this world. You can reach the kind of agreements we reached with the Soviets during the height of the Cold War. Remember, for example, the Soviet Union was aiding North Vietnam, which was killing hundreds of U.S. soldiers every week in the Vietnam War. And while that was happening, Richard Nixon negotiated the first serious arms control agreement with them, the SALT Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. This is what you do with your adversaries. You negotiate agreements that are in both sides' strategic interests, limiting the arms race, even though you have fundamental differences with their behavior on other issues in other parts of the world. This is not about negotiating peace with your friends. This is about negotiating your security, giving them security guarantees, of reaching this kind of enforceable, verifiable agreements that can reduce the risks that you face in the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, in a recent talk in San Francisco, you outlined a new moment facing U.S. nuclear policy. In addition to Iran, what distinguishes this moment?
Yeah, and I wrote an article for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists on this called a new nuclear policy moment. It's not because I want there to be a new policy, although I do, but it's my analysis of the trends that I see that are converging at this point that make a new policy possible. And briefly, number one trend is the failure of the current policy. Every single nuclear threat that the Trump administration inherited has gotten worse because of the policies they've implemented. Iran, North Korea, relations with Russia, the nuclear arms race that is now has every nuclear armed country building new nuclear weapons. Everyone's gotten worse, the money that we're spending. So there's becoming more and more widely recognized. That leaves a policy vacuum. That leaves a demand for and a need for a new policy. So where does that new policy come from? That's the second factor. The Democrats have taken over the House of Representatives, and it's not just the fact that another party controls it, but the kinds of Democrats you see now, many whom identify with the new activist leadership, as they say, related to the movements that are moving through American civil society, and they see themselves as responding to those movements, empowered and brought to office by those movements. And they're joined by veterans like Adam Smith, the new chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, who said he wants to fundamentally redo U.S. nuclear posture. So you have that kind of mechanism set up, that kind of interest and that kind of power in Congress, you can really propel a vigorous debate and hash out the elements of what a new policy should be. And that brings you to factor number 3, the presidential campaigns, where you see a number of candidates, when they're asked, what's the greatest danger we face, they answer nuclear weapons, or they answer Iran, they answer Russia, all related to the threat of nuclear weapons. So you see the presidential campaigns are where people like Senator Elizabeth Warren have endorsed the kinds of policies she sees Adam Smith promoting in the House Armed Services Committee. She puts it 3 elements: no new weapons, no first use of nuclear weapons, and more arms control, not less. So that builds up the political support. That turns us into a national debate, and that gets you to the fourth factor, which I see as the rise of the new mass movement. There were more people actively engaged, now mobilized on issues in this country than we've seen in a very, very long time. Basically, you saw it erupt with the Women's March on January 21st, 2017, and it has just spread and continued. And they're fighting on a lot of fronts, but one of those fronts is also national security. So if we can link these kinds of issues, these kind of nuclear issues, with the other issues of these mass movements, for example, you want Medicare for all? Well, how are you going to pay for that? Well, how about that $2 trillion we're about to spend on new nuclear weapons over the next 25 years? $2 trillion for weapons we don't need. You can take some of that and fund your Medicare for all. Or the Green New Deal, how fundamentally, changing the way America produces its energy, where you can't just do that by regulation and taxing the wealthy. You're going to have you need some existing government funds repurposed. You can get some of that from the excessive military budget, including the excessive nuclear weapons budget. So you link these demands together, and you have a comprehensive, powerful plan for what a progressive government policy would actually be. And finally, as I mentioned, there's the budgetary pressures that are finally making people wake up to realize you can't give away $1 trillion in taxes and cut taxes and somehow be able to afford all the things you need. Something's got to give. We think nuclear weapons budget can be part of that. So that's what makes me hopeful that these factors can help us produce a new policy over the next couple of years with the debates in Congress. And if a new president is elected in 2020, that president can come into office with the policy that she's ready to implement in a vigorous way in that first year of office. So for me, my timeline is a 3-year timeline. Starting right now, we're in the middle of the first year, going all the way to the end of 2021. A policy and a plan to implement it to fundamentally transform U.S. nuclear policy.
You mentioned presidential candidates in that last response, and your organization, Plowshares Fund, has been asking presidential candidates to make a pledge never to use nuclear weapons first. You mentioned Elizabeth Warren. Are you getting any other reaction to that?
You see, of the candidates who are now concerned about national security, and let's be honest, this is a secondary consideration in these debates, but still an important one. You see Bernie Sanders out front on this issue. You see others like Amy Klobuchar saying that they would re-enter the Iran anti-nuclear agreement as soon as they were elected office. In fact, all of the top tier, the top 10, 12 presidential candidates have said they will re-enter the deal. In fact, the only one I think who hasn't said that is Senator Booker, who has a fantasy of negotiating a new deal somehow. I don't think that's going to happen. If you want to deal with Iran, you have to first re-enter the deal we have and then build on it. So we are seeing some of this, but it's our job outside, as activists, as organizers, as experts, to press the candidates to get more specific. Because if they go into office, if they assume office in January 2021, which is a vague sentiment about how they feel about nuclear weapons, they're going to get crushed by the nuclear industrial bureaucracy. Nothing will change. So you have to understand there's $55 billion worth of contracts pulsing through the system right now on nuclear weapons and related projects like the missile defense system we have that doesn't work. If you want to shut those off, if you want to change that, if you want to go up against the contractors and the parochial interests in the states and districts, you better have a plan on how to do that. That's the key element that's missing so far.
You mentioned the number of different activists and all the different things that people are fighting for, the women's movement, all these different things. What's your sense now of the willingness and commitment of activists and voters engaging on this specific issue? Or do you sense there's maybe a feeling of just, we'll wait until we have a new president?
It's for most of the activists, like Indivisible and Move On, and it's so encouraging to me to see this level of activism and sophistication. Indivisible in particular, man, what a new organization. How exciting this is. But for most of them, this is a war and peace issue. This is how it presents. They're not going to get involved in the wonky details of nuclear weapons, whatever they personally think of them. What's going to move the millions of people in those organizations? It's the threat of a new war. So that's why the Iran issue is first and foremost. But when you get into that, you quickly have to address, well, how do you solve the Iran issue? It's not just stop the war, it's what you have to replace it. And I've been very encouraged by the kind of activism I've seen, particularly from those groups that can get millions of people writing their representatives, calling, and potentially out on the streets. If you want to stop the war in Iran, I do believe at some point there's going to need some mass demonstrations against the war to demonstrate our opposition to that. It's encouraging, but I recognize this is always going to be a secondary, tertiary issue for these groups who are primarily motivated by domestic issues, but it's a necessary part, and I'm encouraged by the increased discussion you're seeing of these things in magazines and journals, the way members are engaging on this, the willingness of the House leadership in particular to take some of these issues up. And the presidential campaigns are going to give us our best chance in years to develop the framework of a new nuclear policy. We can't miss this moment.
Absolutely. Joe Ciricione, president of Plowshares Fund, the Global Security Foundation, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Joe, as always, a pleasure to speak with you. We really appreciate your time, and of course, we'll do it again soon.
You are very kind. Thanks for having me on. I look forward to coming back. Fantastic.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, how Trump's tax cuts work for the wealthy and why we need a tax plan that works for everyone. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Once upon a time, there was a place where the prevailing ethic of the very richest people was that monetary self-indulgence was tacky and that wealth was a matter of good fortune, carrying with it an obligation to the common good. Believe it or not, that place was the USA. Where did it go? The prevailing ethic of today's billionaires club is one of entitlement, superiority, and grandiosity, including flaunting their wealth like the robber barons of old. For example, a ludicrously large, quote, house is under construction in Florida for one of our modern-day barons, boasting 11 kitchens, 5 swimming pools, and a 30-car garage. Worse, the billionaire class is asserting its sense of plutocratic privilege by weaponizing their huge fortunes. They've been spending massively and often secretly to build a culture of inequality across our land. To their dismay, however, America's workaday majority is rebelling, with newly elected Democratic populists like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proposing a 70% tax rate on incomes above $10 million. Oh, the horror, shrieked billionaires like computer magnate Michael Dell. Name a country where that's worked, he demanded dismissively. Okay, Michael, how about the United States? Yes, between the end of World War II in 1945 and Ronald Reagan's start of coddle-the-rich government in 1981, the top tax rate never fell below 70%, and that was a period of unparalleled growth and prosperity for America's middle class. This is Jim Hightower saying, Dell, who lives in a sprawling 33,000-square-foot house with all the charm of a shopping mall, confuses value with money and has no grasp of the essential richness of American egalitarianism. We should not be listening to people like him, much less being governed by them, just because they're rich.
What do the corporate powers from Wall Street to Walmart have in common? They hate the Hightower Lowdown. You can see why at www.hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. President Trump's tax cut plan is proving to be a huge giveaway for corporations and the wealthy. Frank Clemente offers a progressive plan for tax reform that can bring fairness to the American economy. And we say hello to Brian Ott, professor of communication studies and director of the TTU Press at Texas Tech University. His chief research interest concerns the intersection of rhetoric and media, and he studies how communication technologies influence and shape the character of public discourse. He's also the author, along with Greg Dickinson, of The Twitter Presidency, Donald J. Trump and the Politics of White Rage. Brian Ott, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, our pleasure to speak with you today. And we're going to start with an essay that you recently wrote for USA Today titled, Trump's Tweets Are Destroying Democracy and We Won't See the Big Picture for Years. There's a lot to unpack in that one title. To begin with, we often, at least I don't know if I can speak for everybody, for most people though, we laugh at Trump's tweets. But can they really do serious damage to democracy?
Yes, I believe they can. To understand how, it's helpful to back up a little bit. So Twitter is the president's preferred mode of communication, and he has credited his 2016 election victory to his use of it. So President Trump prefers this mode of communication because it allows him to address his core followers while bypassing the mainstream news media and, in the process, bypassing fact-checking. And that matters in this instance because of the president's propensity for telling lies, of which he has told nearly 11,000 since taking office, according to the Washington Post. And that means that, that he's averaging about 12 false or misleading statements every day in office. And the problem is it's not just his ability to spread propaganda and disinformation via Twitter that's dangerous. It's also his unprecedented and really unrelenting attacks on democratic institutions like our judicial system, a free and independent press, and even his own intelligence agencies. And then finally, I would just add that, the character of his communication erodes civility, promotes political violence, and fuels racism and hatred. So yes, the damage he can, and in my mind actually is doing, is both serious and substantial.
Yeah, I mean, we are certainly getting a live view of it. The other provocative line in your intro is that we won't see the big picture for years to come. How do you see the impact of Trump's tweets lasting long beyond his presidency?
Mm-hmm. So really, the central point that I'm trying to get after in the USA Today piece is that the form, the very packaging of messages is absolutely central to their effects. So the form of Trump's messages, which are largely disseminated on Twitter and then further sort of fragmented by an endlessly changing news cycle, make it difficult for us to see the effects of the president's tweets. And you could really take sort of any short period of time with the president and demonstrate what we're talking about. I know in my own sort of following of the president, just in the last 24 hours, he accused Robert Mueller of criminal behavior. He suggested that he couldn't have raped E. Jean Carroll because she's not his type. He told a reporter that what he tells Putin is none of our business. He implied that he was happy about John McCain's death and suggested that he's in hell. He railed against American soccer star Megan Rapinoe. And he warned of new tariffs on China and possibly Vietnam. That was in a 24-hour period. And you can really choose any 24-hour period, and it would look like that. And each of these microbursts, as I call them, is in its own way an assault on basic norms of decency and democracy. But we can't fully process those assaults and their social costs because they come so frequently and so rapidly with this president.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny reading that article, and it's like, oh yeah, that's right, he said that. Oh yeah, that's right, he said that. I mean, it is nonstop. It's a barrage. Let's turn to the book that you wrote, as I mentioned at the top, with Greg Dickinson, titled "The Twitter Presidency: Donald Trump and the Politics of White Rage." Why was it important to have white rage in that title?
Yeah, so one of the central premises of the book is that President Trump's rhetoric is unified and animated by style, much more so than by content. And in fact, the content of Trump's rhetoric is, it's often nonsensical, which is immediately evident if you've ever tried to read a transcript of one of his campaign rallies, for instance. But the way he communicates through microbursts of anger and impulsivity is as important, if not more important, than what he communicates. So white rage was our attempt to name Trump's fundamental rhetorical style, his way of communicating, as succinctly as we possibly could. And this style, we argue, has two major dimensions. First, anger and indignation at the perceived decentering of white masculinity. And second, sort of an unapologetic performance of white male privilege. Now, since neither of these dimensions is rooted in any kind of rational argument, they are compelling to his followers on sort of an emotional or embodied level. In other words, they sense or feel his rage, and they identify with it.
We're speaking with Brian Ott, professor of communications studies and director of the TTU Press at Texas Tech University, also the author, along with Greg Dickinson, of The Twitter Presidency, Donald J. Trump and the Politics of White Rage. And Brian, you've written how Twitter is well-suited, and you mentioned, to simplicity, impulsivity, and incivility. Do you ever advocate that we just ignore what gets said on Twitter, not only by the president, but by others? Or is it important that we remain aware of what's being said?
So Twitter, like any platform or mode of communication, has its own unique structural biases, which you've just identified. The biases of a given platform make it effective for some communication tasks and less effective for other communication tasks. And if I can steal an example from Neil Postman's famous 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, he talks about smoke signals. And he suggests that, smoke signals are an effective way to communicate the idea of a threat over a very great physical distance. But it's a pretty lousy way to do philosophy. So similarly, Twitter is great at sending messages quickly and widely. And it turns out it's also pretty effective at transmitting emotion. But it is far less amenable to sending complex, sophisticated, and perhaps even more importantly, thoughtful and well-considered messages. Now, I don't know about you, but I would prefer international politics and foreign relations be conducted in thoughtful and considered ways, not in 280-character eruptions on Twitter at 5 a.m. So I'm not suggesting we ignore Twitter, only that we recognize it has strengths and weaknesses, and that consequently, maybe we choose not to have our politics live there.
Yeah, fair enough. And I would have to agree with that. But, I guess there's a contradiction of sorts that we should probably talk about. Free speech, of course, is a core value of democracy. And it has led to Twitter, which in the hands of this president is a threat to democracy, as you've pointed out. So how do you reconcile these two thoughts?
This is tricky. Let me unpack or build on my previous answer a little bit. So I'm not trying to restrict what the president chooses to communicate. I'm simply pointing out that the form of the message matters and has real material consequences. And furthermore, that those consequences are often less immediately evident to us, given the form. So text messaging, for instance, while a great way to let a friend know that you're running late for a lunch appointment, is probably not the best platform for conducting a job interview. But Trump, and maybe it's because he's ill-informed or narcissistic or both, I don't know. Either he doesn't get this or he doesn't care about this distinction. And that, in and of itself, I find unsettling. But actually, I think Twitter is probably the president's preferred mode of communication precisely because it masks his lack of substance or content. Now, here's the corrective. As long as the public is informed and reflexive about these distinctions, which is part of what my job is, it matters far less what the president says and how he says it.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I mean, and it's with everything you just said too. To me, it's an example, and he paints this picture of somebody that really doesn't have any idea what he's doing. And these little fitful, childish anger bursts that you've mentioned, it's pretty destructive. I'm going to bounce back before we let you go to the USA Today piece.
Sure.
You suggest that the America Donald Trump leaves us when he finally leaves office will be unrecognizable. Do you have enough faith in our democratic norms, though, that we will be able to find our way way back?
That's a great question. I think it depends quite a great deal on what happens both in the 2020 election and in Congress regarding impeachment prior to the election. Unlike many, I'm unconvinced that defeating President Trump in the next election and impeachment are mutually exclusive. They're not. And in fact, impeachment hearings might actually be critical to defeating Trump. But failing to do either would, in my estimation, so erode the norms of democracy and decency that it would be exceedingly difficult to reverse the damage he's doing. And let me give you a very specific example that's from the USA Today piece of what I mean, although I'm going to elaborate on it a bit. If it were possible, if it were possible to unhear everything the president has said over the past 2.5 years, then the statement he made recently indicating a willingness to accept aid from a foreign power to win an election, and his claims that perhaps he'll stay in office indefinitely, those would be so outrageous that they would immediately lead to impeachment. But the fact is, we're no longer shocked about the erosion of these basic norms. So imagine, alternatively, if you will, if Trump is in office for 8 years. Will we even care or notice about the norms? I mean, if he starts talking about jailing members of the press because they've written things that are critical of him, 8 years from now, will we even care? And I get it. I recognize that sounds alarmist. But as someone who has spent a career studying media and rhetoric and their intersection, I know that it's already happening every day, a little bit, tweet by tweet.
You know, I couldn't fathom him being elected president the first time around. I certainly can't fathom it happening a second time around. And I tell you what, boy, we're in trouble if it happens. Brian Ott, professor of communication studies and director of the TTU Press at Texas Tech University, also the author, along with Greg Dickinson, of The Twitter Presidency, Donald J. Trump and the Politics of White Rage, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Brian, thank you for your time with us today. We'd certainly appreciate it and would love to have you back and talk to us again soon.
Thanks so much. Happy to come back.
Fantastic. Thanks again. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Ambassador Wendy Sherman on the possibility of war with Iran and the narrowing space for diplomacy under Donald Trump.
Given that there were heavier hitters tonight, on Thursday night than there were Wednesday night. But overall, first of all, I just want to say I was really proud of the fact that, as a Democrat, that these 20 people up on stage, I mean, they were good people with good ideas, no embarrassment, no major gaffes. I thought every one of them did well, and I would take any one of them over Donald Trump. It's just
would that include Marianne Williamson?
That would even include Marianne Williamson,
okay.
Yes, who might have been running for a different office, but she's a smart woman and she's got some good ideas. So overall, I got to say, I thought it was, and I think the DNC did a good job. The rules they set down for the debate, the choices that they made, and the way it was staged for staging of the debate by the Democratic National Committee, I just say kudos to them. In terms of the Thursday night debate, I believe the clear winner was Kamala Harris. She was tough. She was articulate. She proved, I think, she could take on Donald Trump. She proved certainly she could take on Joe Biden. I thought she showed the most fire without being angry and without shouting. And I also thought she had the best line of the night when she just said, at one point when everybody was talking over each other, you couldn't understand what anybody was saying. And she just broke in and said, hey, friends here, Americans don't want a food fight. They want food on the table, and just sort of shut everybody down.
So what rating would you give her on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being best?
For tonight, I'd give her a 10 out of a 10. I don't think she could have done any better. From start to finish, I thought she dominated the debate, and I thought that was clear with the audience at home and was clear with the small audience that I watched it with.
And Joe Biden was the man with the most to lose, standing in the center of the stage with the highest polling averages. How did he do?
Every Major League Baseball player has a bad night. I thought Joe Biden did maybe not a bad night, but he certainly did not have a great night. I didn't even think he had a good night. He seemed to be off his game to me. Again, didn't embarrass himself. He fought back a couple of times, but I thought Kamala Harris definitely got the better of him on the exchange over his bragging about the support of two known racist senators. By the way, I understand why he worked with them. I understand what he accomplished by working with them, extending the Voting Rights Act for 25 years. But I don't think Joe Biden made the point. I also thought he seemed he seemed kind of lost at a couple of points. The fact that twice he just stopped in mid-sentence and said, "Oh, my time is up." I mean, Jesus, this is a debate when you want to get every make every point and get every word in, and everybody else, they just talked over the moderator if necessary to finish their point. Joe Biden, again, it looked lost. And I mean, if he can't stand up to Chuck Todd, can he stand up to Donald Trump? So I think Joe actually hurt himself tonight. I wouldn't be surprised to see him drop a little bit in the polls.
And what rating would you give him for tonight?
Probably a 5.
I think tough, but that's right.
Yeah, that is tough. But again, didn't embarrass himself. But NBC put, like they did Wednesday night with Elizabeth Warren, they purposely staged Joe Biden right in the middle of the platform because they saw him as a star, and they also designed the closing segments, the closing statements, just like they did with Elizabeth Warren, to give Joe Biden the last word because they wanted to hit it out of the park, and he did not.
What about the man standing next to him, the other grandpa in the field, Bernie Sanders?
Well, I was a big Bernie supporter in 2016. I still like Bernie. I like Bernie's ideas. I thought that Bernie, he was certainly one of the major players tonight. Probably it'll show that he spoke as long as anybody else. But I think Bernie's problem is he's only got one gear, which is full speed, angry, loud, shouting, and waving his arms. And I'm afraid that turns people off. I never saw him smile once. I didn't see him even speak in a normal tone of voice once. I thought he was very strong in the points he was making about the problems with the present system, with the private insurers. That's never going to work by leaving them in the game. But again, I think he may have turned some people off with the just in-your-face shouting way that he makes his points.
It's true that at a campaign rally, that's an effective style.
Exactly.
It may not be that effective on television.
Right.
So what would you give him as a rating?
Probably a little better than Joe Biden. Maybe 6 or 7.
Okay. And the other person with a lot to gain or lose was the mayor, Pete Buttigieg. How did you think he did?
I thought Pete Buttigieg did well. I think he needed a bigger boost. I think he needed, a bigger boost than he got out of tonight. I thought he at times appeared a little wonky, and maybe too wonky, and too kind of flat in making his points and not showing any emotion. I expected him to do better, and I think he needed to do better to keep that, to regain the momentum that he had, which he's sort of lost since he's been sidelined by this shooting of a white policeman of a black man in South Bend, Indiana. And so I thought he didn't get the boost tonight that he needed.
And what would you give him?
Say, I know your next question. I would say I'd give him maybe a 6.
Mm-hmm. The other well-known person who needed a big night to break out from the pack is Kirsten Gillibrand, the senator from New York. Did she get a boost?
I do not believe that she got the boost that she needed. She certainly tried. She was not shy. She jumped in several times, grabbed the microphone, but I don't think she scored. I don't think she appeared as informed on the issues or as aggressive and willing to fight on the issues and as tough on the issues as Kamala Harris, for example. And I think that was her challenge, is to show that she's the woman of the women in the race, that she's the one that people ought to turn to rather than Kamala Harris. If that was Kirsten Gillibrand's goal tonight, she failed. Didn't embarrass herself, didn't fall on her face. I'd give her a 5 probably as well.
Bill Press talking with Ambassador Wendy Sherman on the Bill Press podcast. If you'd like to hear the rest of this interview, visit BillPressShow.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Shelley Gupta-Barnes, Frank Clementi, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.